I'm going to pick up where Reverend Forbes left off. I want to reflect for a few moments on the question of the why this disparity. How do we understand the disparity? And I want to offer a number of different explanations, not one of which is sufficient, but I think all of which are necessary to understand this dynamic. So one, our popular culture equates fundamentalism and religious authenticity in almost every faith. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, the dynamic plays out over and over again. I even suspect that most mainline Protestant denominations and theologically liberal Jewish streams will confess that this affects even the way some of their own members think about religion. For the media, it becomes self-perpetuating. As the media features so frequently conservatives as the authoritative voice of religion. Second, the overwhelming presence in the news media of conservative religious voices leads to the false implication that to be religious is to be conservative, and worse, that to be progressive is to lack faith or even to be against faith. The polls in America show that nothing could be further from the truth. The polls have consistently shown that people of faith have long been and will continue to be, to include large numbers of active members and leaders of progressive causes for justice. The polls overwhelmingly show that a substantial majority of Americans define themselves as centrists or moderates, not as conservatives. The fact that they make the linkages between their faith and progressive politics isn't a coincidence, for it is as religiously compelling in their lives to make that connection as it is in the religious lives of conservatives to make the connections that they make. Third, the result of these biases means that when media want religious perspectives on policy and social justice issues, they tend not to regard religious leaders as having more moral authority than academics, policy experts, or politicians. But when they want the moral voice on the right, they do tend to turn to religious leaders. Fourth, reinforcing this is a dynamic that religious right leaders, almost by definition, are far more likely to overtly claim that their view is the authoritative religious view, that God has instructed them what to say on political issues. Politically liberal religious leaders tend to be more pluralistic, respectful of different voices, and so lose some of the political and media-wise drama of making the kind of declarations that one hears from the right. It is often more challenging to articulate a clear, concise, theological stance on political issues. Yet when some do, Jim Forbes and Bob Egger as examples, Jim Wallace as an example, in the public mind, they tend to get more attention than others representing the mainstream churches. Interesting, and you'll have to ask later, Bruce, this question of why Catholics representing the Catholic Church were not included in this, and I suspect it is the difficulty of differentiating between conservative and liberal. On some issues, profoundly conservative would have greatly upped those numbers. On other issues, profoundly liberal would have greatly upped those numbers, and it was probably a complex calculation to do, but something to reflect on. And that has to be considered as part of it, because they're not fundamentalists in the sense that fundamentalist Christians believe they are fundamentalists. And add to the numbers I was talking about before. 6, media likes more extreme or confrontational views. It is the people not representing often mainstream institutions. Reverends Farwell, Robertson, Perkins, Dobson, Sharpton, Jackson, Rabbi Lerner, who get the most play. Reverend Egger and Reverend Wallace are exceptions, but each because of some of the other factors that I have noted or will note. Seventh, since American society, particularly its political and entertainment culture, has been predominantly liberal in the past century, the voices in the right are the more sensational and confrontational, since they're attacking the status quo. And even as conservatives' views have gained political ascendancy, the pattern of running against the culture, against the government, as the other, the enemy, the source of the problem, continues, and the media buys into it and gives greater coverage to that. Eighth, this is exacerbated by the man bites dog approach to the news. If the culturally confrontational views come more from the right, you will feature them. What's more likely to make your pages? Be honest about this. Or to make your networks. Reverend Dobson's attack on SpongeBob as tearing at the soul of America, or David Saperstein's defense of SpongeBob as not tearing at the soul of America. 8, as the religious right emerged, it had a more cohesive nature than most mainline religious groups did, excepting the Catholic Church, of course. Reverends Falwell and Robertson, Dobson, Richard Land, were seen as representing vast components of that community. The mainline liberal theological groups are far more fragmented. As evidence, I would note in the study that the one voice that is seen as most representative, the NCC's Bob Edgar, did better than most in this survey. And I think I got my numbers mixed up. 10th now, money and the amount that is put into the media. The right recognized the power of media early on. They invested significantly in it. Most mainline denominations and many progressive advocacy organizations have 1 or 2 people in their media offices. The National Council of Churches, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, People for the American Way, have more than most, with 4 to 7 people working in their communications office. And they do much better than most among liberal groups that deal with faith and public policy issues. The Family Research Council has similarly sized department with 7 people working in their communications office. 2 in broadcasting. Broadcasting creates its own news. 2 in web communications, 2 in media, and overseeing it a vice president of the Family Research Council for Communications. Heritage Foundation has 30 people in their department. I couldn't get from the website Focus on the Family, but with their 1,250 employees, I suspect it is even a far greater department. So there are these number of factors, these 10 that I've mentioned, that help explain the dynamics of why this dichotomy about it. But so long as the polls indicated that it is the centrist, moderate organizations that represent Reverend Bob Edgar.